Again, a word of welcome as we continue this journey, this third weekend of Advent. A weekend that traditionally in our Advent journey, it calls us to perhaps a little more of an emphasis of our understanding around what it means to rejoice, what it means to be renewed with a sense of hope, which can be, in a world in which we live, a fairly major challenge. The traditional, darker, if you will, more shadow tones of Advent, and an emphasis of waiting gives way to our need to reflect on the deeper joy of God's profound grace and love, while anticipating the fullness of our spiritual rebirth that is made possible in the coming of Christ at Christmas. It's why we have focused throughout this Advent season of what it is to be the light to one another in darkness. And today traditionally lifts up that brighter focus. At the same time, it raises up what the challenges are to be hopeful. This third Sunday pause and shift in our focus is rather symbolic all unto itself. In itself, it bears a message of hope. So as Julie reminded us and invited us today, it's important for us to take this deep breath. Think about the birthing process that we have been involved in and lifting up hope in a special way on this particular weekend in Advent. The realization that we are never alone amid the many challenges of our life. God's love and compassion are always with us, beckoning us forward, offering us healing, support, and renewal, even in times in which it's difficult to see that in our lives. Today's readings that Pat Murphy read brim with a great sense of hope and joy. The prophet Isaiah addressed the beleaguered people of Israel who longed to return home from years of living in exile as captives. As we heard in that reading from Isaiah, say to those whose hearts are frightened, be strong and fear not. Isaiah's message to the people of Israel is in all practical purposes a rousing pep talk. He presents a compelling vision of comfort, well-being, and even opulence. He recalls what must have felt like, to many hearing it, a trip down memory lane about the good old days. The community becomes emboldened as they recall the God that they once knew as the God that brought justice, the God that brought mercy, the God that brought healing, the God that they could feel and rejoice in on a regular basis. That same God will soon come again with vindication, the prophet tells. Indeed, Israel will know again the joy and the gladness of Zion. Israel's imagination expands, allowing people to actually visualize crossing the formidable desert that confines them in exile apart from their true home. They're homesick and they're in pain. Who among us has not experienced a similar sense at times of desperation? A desperate need to go home, amid the violence and the complexities of life, either in your personal life or certainly the life of the world in which we live. Who among us is not a bit homesick for what we may have felt like was, at least in our minds, a simpler, peaceful, and more joyful life? It is exactly that reading that brings us to the letter from James. It is where we hear a more challenging message from the letter of James. Not surprisingly, we hear the squabbles that are going on in the early church. The early Christian community experienced a variety of controversies as they discerned how to follow Jesus apart from the time of having his physical presence. We think frequently in our generation that we are the church that has had all the struggles. And we do, but I assure you that has been true from the very beginning of the Christian experience. There have been many rough roads to travel. Our present portion, again, or segment of the letter from James, addresses that dimension of the human spirit, that part of our spirit that longs for totality, that longs for a sense of complete joy, that part of us that longs for a complete and immediate sense of hope, that part of us that longs for a comfortable predictability to our life. We would love to know what's going to happen next. We'd love to have that assurance. And yet, we as humans, our limitations very frequently stand behind our disagreements. Our human limitations stand behind our disappointments. Our human limitations are at the center of many of our conflicts. And we seemingly grow ever more anxious, and in fact, actually quite impotent in our striving for resolution. When we're perfectly honest, we live a rather complicated and at times conflicted life. But James reminds us that the totality that we long for can only be found in God. We can run, but we can't hide. The truth of the matter is we will always be incomplete without being in the presence of God. It is only being in the presence of God and trusting on that we can find ourselves sufficient, and knowing that we indeed are enough. Thus, yet today, we are challenged to allow God's Spirit to transform our longing into a constructive patience. In all these many conflicts, we're called to that gift of patience. Speaking only for myself and probably, hopefully, everybody in this room, we would all agree to look for any patience at times is a Herculean effort, let alone a constructive gift of patience. We are called to be, as we heard in that reading from James, like the wise farmer, patiently relying on the natural cycles of rain. We need to exercise patience over our desires for fullness, completeness, and perfection. Regrettably, if we can't have it all right now, oftentimes we're not willing to play. Therein lies the need for patience, to know that we're not going to always have it all of the time. We struggle indeed with those desires, those needs for completeness, and oftentimes our need to be perfect. We struggle today, wondering what to do in the midst of that. One thing very specifically is that we need to be much more intentional about healing our suffering planet, our Mother Earth. So we turn to the gospel today from Matthew. Perhaps there is no greater challenge to patience than to be legally and unjustly imprisoned by an imperialistic authority, just as John the Baptist was. So, how was it possible for John to find hope or joy in such dire circumstances? As John was in prison, he had the courage to ask a hard question. Are you the one that we have been waiting for, or is there yet another one to come? To ask the question and to risk not knowing and not hearing the answer. And even though it's not clear that John's disciples returned to John to tell John the answers that Jesus gave, we don't know if they did or didn't. But what we do know is that we have those answers. And those answers are these. The blind regain their sight. The lame will walk. Lepers will be cleansed. The deaf will hear. The dead will be raised. And the poor will have the good news proclaimed. These are the signs of hope that mark God's fidelity and God's presence to us to this very day. We have in this Advent season turned brilliantly to our Sister Joan Chittister, signaling that God's dream for the world is us, you and I. That we are the light to one another in the darkness. But in order for us to sustain faith and to live in joyful expectation of the fullness of God's reign, we again recognize our human limitations. Our human limitations that require that we have experience on a pretty regular basis of concrete proof of God's presence in our life. That what we wait for and hope in is real. We need to be able to see it in a tangible way. So how do we wait fully awake? How do we wait fully aware and without complacency? How do we wait without compliance? How do we break this cacophony of materialism and violence of a very perplexed and complex world that we live in? How do we maintain hope in all of that noise and all of that disturbance? How do we make the message of this Advent live beyond the walls of this gymnasium? We speak frequently of how good we feel when we are in this room. The message that we proclaim, the message we hear, the message we sing, all of the interactions give us every reason to be hopeful. But I think on this third weekend of Advent, it calls the question, where does that all go when we leave this room? When we are waiting in traffic, when we are waiting in the checkout line, when we are laying next to that person in our life with whom we are giving the cold shoulder, when we are not in relationship to family, when we are not in relationship to ourselves. How do we, in those moments, maintain a sense of hope? How do we rejoice when we leave this address? How will we be signs of hope to the world around us after we've had our coffee and cookie? How can we be that people that never, never go away in terms of being a people of hope? And it seems a bit odd that I would be bringing up these three things on a Sunday that we're supposed to be thinking more about hope. But I truly do believe that when we lean into hope, we also need to be able to think about the things that we really do need to do. And I have three things that are most troubling that I want us to think about in our life. And how do we maintain hope in the midst of this? And structural racism, tribalism, and xenophobia thrive in our neighborhoods and in our borders in a way that this old man never remembered in his soon-to-be 70 years. The third thing I want us to think about, the second, is the November 26th UN Emissions Gap Report that warns us very clearly in regards to our Mother Earth. Unless global greenhouse gas emissions fall by 7.6% each and every year between 2020 and 2030, the world will miss the opportunity to meet the 1.5 degree centigrade temperature goal of the Paris Agreement. If we do not embrace our Mother Earth in ways that we never have in the next 10 years, we can kiss it goodbye for generations to come, putting them in a world that we wouldn't even want to think about, and yet are responsible for. And the third piece I want us to think about is the millions around the world that bear the burdens of poverty, hunger, and homelessness. I won't say shame on me on the Sunday that we're supposed to think about hope, that I've launched at least these three things for us to think about. We've asked the question, what is the world waiting for? And I would up the ante to say, why are we waiting? Amen.